a man walks into the back entrance of a busy restaurant, dressed in worn clothes, and is handed a grimy uniform without so much as a glance. To everyone around him, he's just another low-level hire destined to scrape plates and stay invisible. But they don't know this man isn't just a dishwasher. He's the owner. The business they work for and the livelihood they take for granted exist because of his vision, sweat, and sacrifices. And now he's here undercover, watching, listening, and uncovering the truth about the toxic culture festering in the place he built. The tension is immediate, the contradictions unavoidable. Can he unravel years of systemic neglect and prejudice? Or will the weight of betrayal in his company be too much? Before we dive into this gripping story of hidden truths and transformative change, comment below where you're watching from today. And if this story of resilience and justice inspires you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us for more. The glittering skyline of Chicago welcomed Elijah Carter as his plane descended at O'Hare International Airport. It had been 6 months since he left the city to oversee the expansion of his thriving restaurant chain, Soulful Bites, in Europe. Elijah, the founder and CEO, had transformed a single food truck into a renowned name synonymous with creative dishes and heartfelt hospitality. Stepping onto the tarmac, Elijah felt pride in his achievements, but couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. During his time abroad, troubling reports about the workplace culture at Soulful Bites had reached him. These weren't minor grievances. They were allegations of unfair treatment, high turnover rates among Black and immigrant staff, and claims of outright discrimination. This was a bitter pill for a business celebrating diversity and inclusion. After a brisk ride to his penthouse, Elijah barely unpacked his suitcase before powering up his laptop. The restaurant's financial health appeared stellar in the quarterly reports. Profits were soaring, and several new branches had opened. But hidden beneath the glossy success were alarming signs. Resignation letters and anonymous surveys painting a picture of dissatisfaction among the backbone of the operation, the kitchen staff and delivery teams. His HR director, Monica Rivera, had flagged concerning patterns during their weekly calls. Elijah, she had said, her tone heavy with concern. It's not the numbers. It's the people. We've been losing good employees. Some don't even get through their probation. The complaints are consistent: disrespectful management, toxic environments, and worst of all, whispers of racism. The gravity of the situation struck Elijah as he scrolled through employee feedback that evening. One anonymous comment stood out. "I'm yelled at every day and treated as less than human because of the color of my skin." Another read, "The senior staff doesn't value us. They act like we're invisible." Elijah's heart sank. These weren't just reputation issues, but betrayals of the mission on which Soulful Bites was founded. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, Elijah had worked tirelessly to prove himself in kitchens where his talents were often dismissed due to his race. He built Soulful Bites as a haven where every worker felt respected and valued, from the dishwasher to the executive chef. Yet now his vision seemed tainted. During their meeting, Monica laid a thick folder on his desk. "These complaints have been piling up," she admitted, her voice edged with frustration. "It's mostly from the kitchens and delivery departments. Some senior staff don't embody the values you've worked hard to establish." Elijah leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Why didn't I hear about this earlier?" Monica hesitated. "Many employees are too afraid to speak up. They think their voices won't matter, or worse, they'll face retaliation." That night, Elijah barely slept. Memories of his struggles resurfaced, working multiple jobs to put himself through culinary school, enduring the sting of racial slurs, and being underestimated time and again. It was those hardships that had fueled his desire to build a business where equity and opportunity reigned. But now it seemed that Soulful Bites had become everything he'd once fought against. By dawn, Elijah had decided he needed to witness the reality. Reports and second-hand accounts weren't enough. If his restaurants harbored toxicity, he would discover firsthand by going undercover. 2 days after he decided to go undercover, Elijah Carter stood outside the River Point location of Soulful Bites. It was one of the busiest branches in a bustling downtown district. Wearing a faded hoodie, well-worn jeans, and sneakers, Elijah looked like any other entry-level worker. He introduced himself at the back entrance as Eli Jones, the new hire for the dishwashing team. The assistant manager, Harold Mason, barely looked up from his clipboard as he thrust a uniform into Elijah's hands. "You're on dish duty." "Keep up and stay out of the way," he said curtly, already moving toward another task. The kitchen buzzed with frenetic energy. Elijah slipped into his assigned uniform, which smelled faintly of bleach, and went to the dish pit. For hours, he scrubbed pots, scraped food off plates, and loaded trays into the industrial washer. The heat from the machines clung to his skin, and the scent of grease and detergent filled the air. But it wasn't the grueling labor that struck Elijah, but the atmosphere. From his station, Elijah watched the interactions between staff. The head chef, Mark Benson, a tall, stern man in his late 40s, barked orders at the line cooks in a tone bordering on contempt. "How many times do I have to explain this?" Mark snapped at a young black cook fumbling with a saucepan. "Do I need to do your job for you?" The cook, whose name tag read Andre, muttered an apology, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the chef's disdain. Elijah noticed the white-line cooks weren't subjected to the same harsh treatment. They worked confidently, occasionally joking with Mark, who laughed. The disparity was glaring, but what genuinely unsettled Elijah was the silence of the staff of color. Their heads were down, their movements quiet and deliberate, as if trying not to draw attention. As the dinner rush began, Harold appeared in the dish pit, barking orders. "Eli, unload the truck outside. Delivery just came in." Grateful for a break from the steaming pile of dishes, Elijah headed to the loading dock. The delivery was heavy, and as Elijah hauled boxes into the kitchen, he overheard Harold talking to another manager. "These guys are so slow," Harold muttered, loud enough for Elijah to hear. "No work ethic at all." Elijah clenched his jaw, forcing himself to maintain his composure. Growing up in Chicago's South Side, he had faced comments like this, where people often underestimated his drive and intelligence simply because of his race. By the time the dinner service wound down, Elijah's body ached, but his mind raced with everything he had observed. The dismissive tone, the disproportionate workload, and the casual racism weren't anomalies. They were part of a system. During his break, Elijah spoke with Maria, a Latina dishwasher who had worked there for 2 years. "How do you deal with this?" he asked, gesturing to the chaos around them. Maria sighed, her expression weary. "You learn to keep your head down. If you speak up, they make your life harder. I asked Harold once why I always get the closing shifts, and he told me I should just be grateful to have a job." Her words hung in the air, heavy with resignation. Elijah nodded, masking his growing anger. "Has anyone tried to report it?" Maria shook her head. "What's the point? They don't listen. They just call you lazy or say you're overreacting. It's easier just to survive." At the end of his shift, Elijah gathered his things and walked home. His thoughts weighed down by the day's events. These workers, dishwashers, cooks, and delivery drivers were the backbone of Soulful Bites. Yet they were treated as if they didn't matter. The casual racism and toxic work culture weren't just isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a deeper rot. As he reviewed his notes that night, Elijah's resolve hardened. He couldn't ignore the truth unfolding before him. If the values Soulful Bites was built on were being eroded from within, his responsibility was to fix it. He decided he couldn't stop at the dish pit. If he wanted the whole picture, he needed to explore other roles within the company. The next step in his undercover journey would take him beyond the kitchen to the streets as a delivery driver. The following week, Elijah Carter began his second undercover role as a delivery driver for Soulful Bites. At the crack of dawn, he arrived at the central location where the fleet of vans was stored. The vehicle he was assigned stood out, not for its quality but for its glaring deficiencies. The peeling logo, cracked windshield, and constant engine rattle symbolized how the company viewed this essential part of its operations. Elijah adjusted his worn uniform, blending in with the other drivers, many of whom were black or immigrants. Among them was Ahmed, a Somali immigrant in his early 20s who had worked for Soulful Bites for over a year. "You'll get used to it," Ahmed said as they leaned against the van, waiting for their orders. He sipped his coffee and gestured to the vehicle. "Just pray it doesn't break down on you." Elijah chuckled lightly. masking his unease. "Does that happen a lot?" Ahmed smirked, shaking his head. "Let's just say these vans aren't exactly built for reliability, and when they break down, we must fix it or deal with the delay. Management doesn't care as long as the orders go out." Their conversation was interrupted by the manager on duty, Dennis Farrow, a wiry man with a perpetually sour expression. "Move it, Jones," Dennis barked at Elijah. "First order's ready." "You're wasting time." Elijah nodded, loading the bags into the van and double-checking the address. His route took him to a sleek office building in the city's downtown core. Upon arriving, he was directed to a dimly lit back entrance by a security guard who barely spared him a glance. "That's for deliveries," the guard said curtly. Inside, Elijah encountered a young receptionist seated behind a marble counter. She looked up, saw the uniform, and immediately turned back to her computer without a word. "Excuse me," Elijah said politely. "I have an order for Sterling & Co." She sighed audibly, gesturing to a side table. "Just leave it there." Elijah complied, resisting the urge to say anything further. The interaction was brief but stung nonetheless, a small reminder of how easily people like him were dismissed. As he drove back to the restaurant, Elijah's thoughts lingered on the encounter. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated as invisible, and he doubted it would be the last. But now, as the owner of Soulful Bites, he saw these experiences in a new light. The people who represented his company to the public were devalued at every turn. Back at the branch, the atmosphere among the delivery team was tense. Dennis reprimanded Marcia, a middle-aged black driver, for being late with her deliveries. "This is the third time this week, Marcia," Dennis sneered. "If you can't handle the job, maybe you shouldn't be here." Marcia explained that her van had stalled on the freeway, but Dennis cut her off. "Excuses, excuses. Just do better, or don't bother coming back." Elijah had seen Marcia's van. It was in worse condition than his, with a faulty ignition and tires that looked ready to burst. Her safety didn't matter to Dennis, who treated her like she was disposable. Later that night, Elijah sat with Marcia and Ahmed in the break room, eager to hear more about their experiences. "They don't see us as people," Marcia said, shaking her head. "To them, we're just bodies filling a quota. And when something goes wrong, it's always our fault, no matter the circumstances." Ahmed nodded in agreement. "It's worse for the black and immigrant drivers. They treat the white drivers like they're special, giving them the best vans and easiest routes. The rest of us get scraps." Elijah listened, his chest tightening with guilt and frustration. These people kept his business running and brought his brand to customers' doorsteps, yet they were treated with disdain. His final delivery of the night took him to an upscale neighborhood on the city's north side. The house was a wealthy estate with a manicured lawn and ornate gates. When the door opened, a man in a tailored suit stood in the doorway, his expression immediately souring as he saw Elijah. "Took you long enough," the man snapped, grabbing the bag. "Do you people even know what fast delivery means?" Elijah bit his tongue, offering a polite, "Apologies for the delay, sir." "Enjoy your meal." The door slammed shut, leaving Elijah on the porch, his stomach churning with frustration. These moments were far too familiar, where his humanity was disregarded, reduced to a mere function in someone else's life. By the time his shift ended, Elijah was physically and emotionally drained. He returned the van to the lot and thanked Ahmed and Marcia for their camaraderie before heading home. That night, he sat at his desk, cataloging every interaction, every injustice. The culture of neglect and discrimination he had witnessed over the past week wasn't an accident. It was systemic. Elijah knew he couldn't fix everything overnight. But one thing was clear. He owed it to his employees to create a workplace where they felt valued and respected. And that meant taking action immediately. The next step in his journey would require courage and confrontation. Elijah wasn't just gathering evidence anymore, but preparing for reckoning. Elijah Carter returned to his penthouse with an overwhelming sense of clarity and responsibility. Over the past 2 weeks, his time undercover as a dishwasher and delivery driver had peeled back the polished exterior of Soulful Bites, revealing the fractures beneath. The issues weren't isolated. They were pervasive, woven into the very fabric of the company's culture. Late into the night, Elijah reviewed his notes. His observations painted a damning picture. In the kitchen, Black and Latino staff bore the brunt of verbal abuse and were routinely assigned the most menial tasks. Delivery drivers, particularly immigrants and people of color, worked under unsafe conditions with poorly maintained vans and disrespectful management. Employees who dared to speak up were silenced through intimidation or outright dismissal. Each incident, though small on its own, collectively reflected a systemic bias that contradicted the values Soulful Bites claimed to uphold. Elijah met with Monica Rivera, his HR director, the next day in his office. "Monica," he began, his tone somber, "I've spent the past 2 weeks undercover at 2 of our locations. What I've seen and heard is unacceptable." Monica nodded, her expression grim. "I suspected it was bad, but hearing it firsthand must have been eye-opening." "It's more than that," Elijah said. "This company was built on the idea that everyone deserves respect, no matter their role. But what I've seen is the opposite. We're failing our people." He handed Monica a summary of his findings. As she read through the notes, her brow furrowed. "This isn't just bad management," she said. "It's a culture problem, and fixing it won't be easy." "I'm not looking for easy," Elijah replied. "I'm looking for change. But first, we need a clear picture of how deep this goes. I want a full audit, every location, every department." Monica hesitated. An audit of this scale will ruffle feathers, especially among the senior staff. "Are you ready for that kind of pushback?" Elijah's expression hardened. If they're more concerned about their comfort than the well-being of their teams, they don't belong here. Over the next few days, Monica's team began collecting data from every Soulful Bites location. Anonymous surveys and employee interviews shed light on recurring patterns. White employees were given preferential treatment in scheduling and workload distribution. Managers often dismissed complaints from staff of color, labeling them overly sensitive. Despite equal or superior performance from their peers, training opportunities and promotions disproportionately went to white staff. Elijah couldn't ignore the weight of the evidence. His company, which he had built with the dream of inclusivity, perpetuated the same injustices he had fought against. But it wasn't all hopeless. During his time undercover, Elijah also witnessed the resilience of his employees. Despite their challenges, they supported each other, sharing small acts of kindness that kept them going. At the River Point location, he had watched Naomi Morales, a prep cook, step in to help a struggling dishwasher during a particularly chaotic dinner service. "You're not alone," she had said, her voice steady and reassuring. Moments like these reminded Elijah of his workforce's potential, strength, camaraderie, and commitment to the job. Determined to move forward, Elijah decided to confront his senior team. He needed them to understand the gravity of the situation and commit to change. Elijah called for an emergency meeting with the senior managers and head chefs from all locations the following week. The air was thick with tension as they gathered in the conference room. Some attendees whispered among themselves, speculating about the purpose of the meeting. When Elijah entered, silence fell over the room. He carried a stack of papers, the complaints and testimonies he had collected, and placed them on the table before him. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone measured but firm. "Over the past 2 weeks, I've spent time undercover in 2 of our locations. What I've witnessed and heard has been deeply troubling." He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of each person seated before him. Some looked uneasy. Others, like Greg Harper, the head chef at River Point, wore thinly veiled expressions of annoyance. "I've seen employees treated with disrespect, subjected to discrimination, and ignored when they tried to speak up," Elijah continued. "This is not the company I built, and it's not the company I'm willing to lead." Greg leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter, kitchens are high-pressure environments. People make mistakes, and sometimes need tough love to get the job done." Elijah's gaze sharpened. "Tough love is one thing, Greg. Public humiliation and blatant favoritism are another. I've seen how you interact with your staff, and it's unacceptable." Greg's face reddened, but he didn't respond. Elijah went on to share specific examples from his undercover experience. He described the disparities in treatment, the disregard for employee well-being, and the toxic culture that had taken root. "This is a wake-up call," Elijah said, his voice unwavering. "If we don't change, We risk losing the people who make this company what it is. The room was silent, the weight of Elijah's words settling over the group. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah remained behind, staring out the window. The road ahead would be difficult, but he knew it was necessary. His employees deserved better, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to rebuild their trust. In the wake of the tense meeting with his senior team, Elijah Carter knew that addressing the systemic issues at Soulful Bites would require more than stern warnings. Words had power, but action was essential. He resolved to connect directly with the employees most affected by the toxic culture. The workers in the kitchens, dish pits, and delivery teams, those whose voices had been silenced for far too long. Elijah's next stop was the Bronzeville branch, located in a historically black neighborhood of Chicago. This time, his approach was different. He wasn't going undercover to observe, but to listen. When Elijah arrived early that morning, the branch manager, Tim Bradley, greeted him nervously. "Mr. Carter, what brings you here?" Tim's voice carried an eager-to-please tone. "I'm here to shadow the staff," Elijah replied, keeping his tone casual but firm. "I want to understand day-to-day operations from their perspective." Tim blinked, clearly caught off guard, but nodded. "Of course, whatever you need." Elijah spent the first half of the day in the kitchen, watching the team prepare for the lunch rush. Amid the whirlwind of activity, he spoke with Lydia Harris, a young black woman working the prep station. Lydia's knife moved swiftly as she chopped vegetables, her movements precise and practiced. "How long have you been with Soulful Bites?" Elijah asked, keeping his tone light. "Almost 2 years," Lydia replied without looking up. "It's good work, but—" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was listening. "But," Elijah prompted gently. Lydia sighed. "It's exhausting, not just physically, but mentally. No matter how hard I work, it feels like it's never enough. The managers, especially Greg, treat us like we're disposable." "Have you ever reported it?" Elijah asked. Lydia let out a bitter laugh. "And risk my job? No, thanks. I've got bills to pay." Her words mirrored the stories Elijah had heard during his undercover shifts. The fear of retaliation kept many employees silent, allowing the toxic culture to fester, unchecked. Later that afternoon, Elijah joined the delivery team, where he met Miguel Perez, a recent hire in his early 20s. Miguel was loading bags into a van when Elijah approached. "Hey Miguel," Elijah said, introducing himself. "How's the job treating you so far?" Miguel hesitated, his expression wary. "It's okay, I guess, but I've noticed some things." "Like what?" Miguel glanced around, lowering his voice. "Last week, I asked for help with a big order and the manager just shrugged. But when one of the white drivers needed help, he was all over it. It's like they don't even see us." Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. The patterns were undeniable: favoritism, neglect, and a deep-seated disregard for employees of color and immigrants. By the end of the day, Elijah had gathered a wealth of first-hand accounts, each a testament to his employees' challenges. But he had also seen their resilience, the small ways they supported each other despite the hostility around them. During a break, Elijah joined a group of employees in the cramped break room. He framed the conversation as a casual check-in, but asked deliberate questions. "What's the hardest part of your job?" he asked. Lydia was the first to speak. "Feeling like you don't matter," she said bluntly. "Like you're just here to do the work nobody else wants to do." Miguel nodded. "And if you speak up, they make you feel like you're the problem. Like you're ungrateful." Another employee, Dante Williams, a dishwasher in his 30s, chimed in. "It's not just about the work. It's the way they talk to us, the way they look at us. Like we're not worth their time." Elijah listened intently, his heart heavy with each story. These were not isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a deeper issue. And while the journey ahead would be challenging, Elijah was more determined than ever to set things right. As the day ended, Elijah gathered the staff for an impromptu meeting. "I want to thank you all for being honest with me today," he began, his tone earnest. "You've given me a lot to think about, and I want you to know that your voices matter." The employees exchanged skeptical glances. They had heard promises from management before, and many wondered if anything would change. Elijah understood their hesitation, but remained steadfast. "This company wouldn't exist without you," he continued. "And I'm committed to making Soulful Bites a place where you feel valued, not just for your work, but for who you are." That night, as Elijah reviewed his notes, he reflected on the stories he had heard and the strength of the people who had shared them. The path forward would require courage, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to change. He decided to call an emergency meeting with his HR team the following day. It was time to finalize the reforms he had envisioned and hold his management team accountable for the culture they had allowed to thrive. The turning point was here, and Elijah was ready to lead his company toward the inclusive, respectful environment it was always meant to be. Elijah Carter entered the conference room at the Soulful Bites headquarters the next afternoon, ready to confront the senior staff. His emergency meeting had gathered all the head chefs and managers from every branch, and the tension in the room was palpable. Elijah's stack of notes, filled with stories of injustice and systemic neglect, sat on the table before him. As the room quieted, Elijah began. "Thank you for coming. Today's meeting isn't about numbers or quarterly goals. It's about something more important, the people who make this company what it is." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some, like Monica Rivera, the HR director, appeared solemn and supportive. Others, like Greg Harper, the head chef notorious for his harsh management style, looked defensive. Over the past few weeks, Elijah continued, "I've been undercover at 2 of our locations. What I've seen has shaken me to the core. Disrespect, discrimination, a culture that devalues the very people we rely on every single day. This is not what Soulful Bites stands for." The room remained silent, but the weight of Elijah's words was unmistakable. He opened the folder in front of him, pulling out a page. "This is just one example," he said, reading aloud. "I'm yelled at every day and treated like I'm less than human because of the color of my skin." He set the paper down and looked at the group. "How did we let it get to this point?" Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, kitchens are high-pressure environments. Sometimes you have to push people to get results." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Push them, Greg? Is that what you call public humiliation? Favoritism? Dismissing their voices when they come to you for help?" Greg flushed but held his ground. "I treat everyone the same. If someone isn't performing, I call them out. It has nothing to do with race." "Really?" Elijah countered, his tone sharp. "Because I've seen how you call out certain employees. I've watched you give second and third chances to white workers while berating Black and Latino staff for the smallest mistakes." Greg's mouth opened to respond, but no words came out. Elijah turned his attention to the broader group. "This isn't just about one person. It's about a culture we've allowed to thrive. A culture that tells our employees, especially our Black and immigrant workers, that they don't matter, that their voices don't count. And that stops today." The managers exchanged uneasy glances. For many, this was the first time they had been called out so directly. Elijah outlined the reforms he was implementing, starting with mandatory diversity and inclusion training. "This isn't a checkbox exercise," he emphasized. "This is about confronting our biases and learning to lead with respect and empathy." He announced the launch of an anonymous reporting system, overseen by an external ombudsman, to ensure employees could safely voice their concerns. "Retaliation against those who use this system will not be tolerated," Elijah said, his tone firm. Then came the most challenging part, holding the worst offenders accountable. "Greg," Elijah said, fixing the head chef with a steely gaze, "your behavior has been unacceptable. Publicly humiliating staff, creating a hostile work environment, and perpetuating a culture of fear are not leadership qualities." Greg sat stiffly, his face pale. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending further review," Elijah said, his voice unwavering. The room was silent, the gravity of Elijah's decision sinking in. Managers like Greg had operated with impunity for years, believing their behavior was untouchable. That era was over. "This isn't about punishment," Elijah said, addressing the group. "It's about accountability. To build a better culture, we must start by taking responsibility for the harm we've caused." After the meeting, Monica approached Elijah. "That was bold," she said, a mix of admiration and concern. "It had to be," Elijah replied. "If we're unwilling to hold people accountable, then all these reforms mean nothing." Over the next week, the suspension of Greg Harper sent shockwaves through the company. For some employees, it was a long overdue sign of change. It was a wake-up call for others, particularly those in leadership positions. At a follow-up leadership meeting, Elijah addressed the remaining pushback head-on. "I know change is uncomfortable," he said, his tone steady but persistent. "But let me be clear. This is not optional. Urban Plates was built on the belief that everyone deserves respect, whether washing dishes or running the kitchen. You don't belong here if you can't align with that." Some managers nodded, their expressions thoughtful. Others remained skeptical, but Elijah didn't waver. Meanwhile, the effects of his reforms were beginning to take shape. At the River Point location, Naomi Morales, the prep cook who had endured so much, was thriving. She was promoted to sous chef, recognizing her leadership and skill. When Elijah visited the branch to congratulate her, Naomi's face lit up with pride. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said, shaking his hand. "It means a lot to feel seen finally." The delivery team also saw improvements. The vans were serviced regularly, schedules were more balanced, and drivers like Ahmed reported feeling more valued. "It's not perfect," Ahmed admitted during one of Elijah's visits, "but it's a start." Despite the progress, Elijah knew there was still work to be done. The anonymous reporting system had uncovered new issues, from wage disparities to unfair scheduling practices. Elijah tackled each problem with the same determination, ensuring every complaint was thoroughly investigated and addressed. The road ahead was long, but Elijah felt renewed hope. For the first time in months, he saw glimmers of the company he had always dreamed Soulful Bites could be. As the reforms Elijah Carter implemented began to ripple through Soulful Bites, the changes were met with cautious optimism and fierce resistance. While many employees welcomed the new policies, some managers and senior staff resisted, clinging to the old ways that had allowed them to operate without accountability. One afternoon, during an unannounced visit to the Bronzeville branch, Elijah entered a heated confrontation. Greg Harper, the recently suspended head chef, had been reinstated under probation after completing the first round of diversity training. However, his behavior suggested he had learned little. In the bustling kitchen, Elijah found Greg berating Rosa Martinez, a young Latina prep cook. "How hard is it to get this right?" Greg snapped, slamming a container of chopped vegetables onto the counter. "Do I have to do everything myself?" Rosa's hands trembled as she attempted to explain the delay caused by a late produce delivery, but Greg cut her off. "Save it, I'm tired of excuses." The tension in the room was palpable as the other staff members avoided Greg's gaze, focusing intently on their tasks. "Greg," Elijah's voice rang out, firm but calm. The entire kitchen fell silent as heads turned toward him. "A word." "Now." Greg hesitated, his face a mixture of anger and apprehension, but he followed Elijah into the manager's office. Once the door closed, Elijah faced him. "I made it clear during our last meeting that this behavior is unacceptable. You're creating a hostile environment for your team and it stops now." Greg scoffed, crossing his arms. "Look, I run a tight kitchen. If people can't handle the pressure, they may not belong here." Elijah's gaze hardened. "This isn't about pressure, Greg. It's about respect. Your team isn't failing you, you're failing them. Effective immediately, you're terminated." Greg's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious." "I'm dead serious," Elijah replied. "You've been given every opportunity to change and choose not to. Pack your things. HR will follow up with you." Greg stormed out of the office, sending shockwaves through the company. It was a powerful signal for employees that Elijah wasn't just paying lip service to change, he was enforcing it. At the next leadership meeting, Elijah addressed the pushback head-on. "I know some of you are struggling with these changes," he began, his tone steady but persistent. "But let me be clear, this is not negotiable. If you think these reforms are optional, you're in the wrong company." The room was silent as Elijah's words sank in. He saw a mix of guilt, frustration, and in some faces, reluctant understanding. Meanwhile, the positive effects of the reforms were becoming more apparent at the ground level. At the River Point branch, Naomi Morales had fully embraced her new role as sous chef. Once hesitant and cautious, she now led her team confidently and gracefully. During one of Elijah's visits, Naomi pulled him aside. "I just want to say thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "For the first time, I feel like I belong here. Like my work matters." Elijah smiled, shaking her hand. "You've earned this, Naomi. I'm proud of you." The delivery team was also seeing improvements. The vans, once neglected and unsafe, were now regularly maintained. Schedules were balanced more fairly, and drivers like Ahmed reported feeling valued for the first time. "It's not perfect," Ahmed admitted during a conversation with Elijah, "but it's better. And that's something I never thought I'd see here." Despite these successes, challenges remained. While effective, the anonymous reporting system uncovered new issues, including cage theft and unfair scheduling practices. Elijah tackled these problems with the same resolve, ensuring every complaint was investigated thoroughly and resolved fairly. To reinforce the company's commitment to change, Elijah continued making unannounced visits to various locations. These visits allowed him to observe the day-to-day realities of his employees and ensured that the reforms were more than just policies on paper. They were lived experiences. At one branch, Elijah overheard a manager reminding staff about the new reporting system. "If anyone has concerns, don't hesitate to use the hotline," the manager said. "Mr. Carter is serious about making things better." It was a small moment, but it filled Elijah with hope. The culture of fear and silence was beginning to crack, replaced by one of accountability and respect. The turning point came during a leadership workshop led by Dr. Latrice Harris, the diversity and inclusion consultant Elijah had brought in. The workshop focused on understanding unconscious bias and fostering empathy among leaders. During one exercise, managers were asked to reflect on moments when they had failed to listen to their teams. For some, like Monica Rivera, the exercise was enlightening, but for others, the realization was uncomfortable. "This isn't easy," one manager admitted during the discussion. "But I'm starting to see how my actions, or lack of action, have hurt the people around me." Elijah nodded, his heart swelling with both pride and determination. Change was never easy, but it was necessary. And for the first time, he felt that his team was beginning to understand that. By the end of the workshop, many managers approached Elijah to thank him. "This was tough, but it was needed," one said. "I think we're finally moving in the right direction." Elijah knew there was still work to be done, but he also knew they were on the right path. The cracks in the old system were widening, and a more robust foundation began taking shape in their place. Months after Elijah Carter initiated sweeping reforms at Soulful Bites, the changes started taking root. The toxic culture that had festered for years was slowly dismantled, and small but significant victories emerged across the company. At the River Point branch, Naomi Morales had not only excelled in her new role as sous chef, but had become a beacon of leadership for her team. Her transition from a disheartened prep cook to a confident leader symbolized the transformation Elijah hoped to see. During a hectic lunch rush, Elijah observed Naomi in action. A new line cook struggled to plate dishes correctly, his hands trembling as he fumbled with garnishes. Instead of chastising him, Naomi stepped in with calm encouragement. "Take a deep breath," she said, her voice steady. "Focus on one plate at a time. You've got this." The line cook nodded, visibly steadied by her support, and managed to catch up. Watching the scene unfold, Elijah felt a swell of pride. Soulful Bites needed. This kind of leadership is empathetic, patient, and empowering. In the delivery department, the mood had shifted as well. The vans, once a source of constant frustration, were now routinely maintained, and the drivers' schedules were balanced relatively. Ahmed, the Somali immigrant Elijah had befriended during his undercover stint, approached him during a visit. "Mr. Carter," Ahmed said with a wide grin, "it feels good to be proud of where I work. People listen to us now." Elijah shook Ahmed's hand warmly. "You deserve nothing less. Thank you for sticking with us through the hard times." These successes were mirrored at other branches, where employees began reporting feeling valued and respected for the first time in years. The new anonymous reporting system has proven to be a powerful tool. Employees who once feared retaliation now had a safe way to voice their concerns. And each report was met with swift action. When wage theft complaints surfaced at a suburban branch, Elijah ensured the affected workers were compensated and the offending manager was disciplined. But Elijah knew that policy changes and disciplinary actions alone wouldn't fix everything. He believed culture was built through everyday interactions and needed to ensure that the reforms were embraced at every level of the organization. To that end, Elijah continued his unannounced visits to various branches, spending time with staff in the kitchens, dining rooms, and delivery bays. These visits reinforced his commitment to the employees and allowed him to see the impact of the changes firsthand. At the Bronzeville branch, Elijah attended a morning staff meeting led by the new manager, Sandra Hall, a young black woman who had risen through the ranks. Sandra's leadership style was collaborative and inclusive, and it was clear that her team respected her. "We've come a long way," Sandra said to the team, "but we're not done yet. If you have ideas or concerns, bring them to me. This is our workplace, and we all have a part in making it better." The team nodded in agreement, their energy positive and focused. Later, as the staff prepared for the lunch rush, Elijah pulled Sandra aside. "You've created something special here," Elijah said. "Thank you for setting the standard." Sandra smiled. "It's not just me, Mr. Carter, it's the team. They're the ones making this place thrive." Elijah left the branch that day with a renewed sense of hope. The road to change was long, but the progress was undeniable. Elijah planned a company-wide staff appreciation event to celebrate the employees' hard work. Held at a local community center, the event brought together employees from every Soulful Bites location. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement and camaraderie, starkly contrasting the tense, divided environment Elijah had encountered months earlier. As music played and laughter filled the air, Elijah mingled with the crowd, exchanging stories and sharing in their joy. For many employees, this was the first time they felt truly connected to the more prominent Soulful Bites family. During the event, Naomi Morales was invited to give a speech. Standing on the stage, she radiated confidence, a far cry from the hesitant worker Elijah had first met. "When I started at Soulful Bites," Naomi began, "I didn't think my voice mattered. I thought I had to keep my head down and take whatever came my way. But things have changed. Today I feel valued, not just for what I do, but for who I am. That's the kind of culture we've built together, and I'm proud to be a part of it." The crowd erupted into applause, and Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat. This moment, this feeling of unity and recognition, was what he had been fighting for. Later that evening, as the event wound, Elijah stood with Monica Rivera, watching the employees laugh and celebrate. "You've done something remarkable," Monica said, her voice filled with admiration. "This company feels different now, better." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the joyful scene before him. "It's not just me, it's all of us. The people here, they're the heart of this company. I just gave them the space to shine." The night ended with a renewed sense of purpose. For Elijah, this was more than just a milestone. It was a promise to build a workplace where every employee felt valued and empowered. Months after Elijah Carter's reforms began reshaping Soulful Bites, the results were undeniable. What had once been a company mired in toxic behavior and systemic neglect was steadily transforming into a workplace built on respect, accountability, and empowerment. One of the most inspiring transformations was that of Naomi Morales. Now thriving as a sous chef at the River Point branch, Naomi had become a leader others looked up to. Her station ran efficiently, her team communicated seamlessly, and her calm demeanor set the tone for the kitchen. During one particularly hectic lunch service, Elijah observed Naomi struggling to keep up with the pace as a new prep coup. Instead of scolding him, Naomi stepped in with gentle guidance. "You're doing great," she said, her voice steady. "Focus on one thing at a time. You'll get there." The prep cook nodded, his confidence visibly bolstered. Elijah couldn't help but smile. This was the kind of leadership he had always envisioned for Soulful Bites. Nurturing, constructive, and focused on building people up rather than tearing them down. Naomi wasn't the only success story. Across the company, employees who had once felt invisible were stepping into new roles and embracing new opportunities. Ahmed Ali, the Somali delivery driver who had shared his frustrations with Elijah during the undercover phase, was another standout. The reforms had addressed the unfair scheduling practices and van maintenance issues that had long plagued the delivery team. For the first time, Ahmed felt that management genuinely cared about the driver's well-being. Ahmed greeted Elijah with a wide grin one afternoon as he returned from a delivery run. "Mr. Carter," he said, shaking Elijah's hand warmly. "Things are different now. It's hard to explain, but you can feel it. People err. And honestly, I'm proud to work here." Elijah's chest swelled with pride. You've stuck with us through the hardest times, Ahmed. That says a lot about your character. Thank you for believing in us. At the Bronzeville branch, the new manager, Sandra Hall, fostered a culture of collaboration and inclusivity. Sandra, who had risen through the ranks, was known for her open-door policy and hands-on leadership style. Elijah, I've never seen a team like this, Sandra said during one of his visits. They're engaged, communicate, and genuinely care about each other. It's a joy to come to work every day. As Elijah walked through the kitchen, he saw firsthand what Sandra meant. Employees joked and encouraged each other as they worked, starkly contrasting the fear and tension he had witnessed months earlier. Even the anonymous reporting system, which Elijah had been unsure about initially, was proving to be a game-changer. Employees finally spoke up without fear of retaliation, and management took their concerns seriously. When a wage theft report surfaced at a suburban branch, Elijah ensured the issue was resolved. The affected workers received back pay, and the offending manager was removed. It was a clear message to the staff: justice and fairness were now non-negotiable. Despite the progress, Elijah knew there was still work to be done. The leadership workshops led by Dr. Latrice Harris helped many managers confront their biases and adopt more inclusive practices. However, some remained resistant to change. During one workshop, a manager named Dan Peterson voiced his frustration. "I get it," Dan said, his tone defensive, "but it feels like we're bending backward for people who need to work harder." Dr. Harris responded with patience but firmness. "Dan, this isn't about bending over backward. It's about leveling the playing field. It's about ensuring that every employee, regardless of background, has the same opportunities to succeed." Elijah watched as Dan processed her words, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. Change, Elijah reminded himself, was always challenging, but it was necessary, and moments like these were proof that progress was possible. By the end of the workshop, Dan approached Elijah. "I'm still wrapping my head around all this," Dan admitted, "but I want to do better. I owe it to my team." Elijah clapped him on the shoulder. "That's all I ask, Dan. Keep trying." The most powerful testament to the company's transformation came during a quarterly staff appreciation event at a local community center. Employees from every Soulful Bites location gathered to celebrate their collective achievements, and the energy in the room was electric. As the music played and employees shared their growth stories, Elijah moved through the crowd, listening and laughing with his team. For many, it was their first time genuinely feeling part of a family. The room fell silent when Naomi Morales took the stage to give a speech. She spoke confidently and gracefully, her words resonating deeply with everyone present. "When I first started at Soulful Bites," Naomi began, "I didn't think my voice mattered. I thought I just had to survive. But today I feel valued, not just for the work I do, but for who I am. And that's because of the changes we've made together. Thank you, Mr. Carter, for believing in us." The crowd erupted into applause, and Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat. This was why he had fought so hard for employees like Naomi, Ahmed, and Sandra, who deserved to thrive in an environment that respected and valued them. Elijah stood by Monica Rivera as the night wound down, watching the joyous scene. "You've turned this company around," Monica said, her voice filled with admiration. "I didn't do it alone," Elijah replied, his gaze fixed on the smiling faces around him. "They're the reason we've come this far." For Elijah, the event was a turning point, a reminder that while the journey was far from over, Soulful Bites was finally on the path it was meant to take. Months turned into a year, and the once toxic environment of Soulful Bites had undergone a remarkable transformation. The reforms Elijah Carter implemented weren't just holding, they were thriving, creating a ripple effect across the company. Elijah continued his unannounced visits to various branches, but now these visits were marked by warmth and camaraderie. Employees greeted him with smiles, eager to share their stories of growth and progress. The restaurant air was different, lighter, more inclusive, and energized by a shared sense of purpose. At the Riverpoint branch, Elijah stopped by the kitchen during a busy dinner service. Now a confident and respected sous chef, Naomi Morales led her team calmly. A new cook struggled with the grill during the rush, but Naomi's patience never wavered. "You're doing fine," she said, her tone steady and encouraging. Let's work through this together. The cook nodded, his tension easing as Naomi guided him. Elijah couldn't help but feel immense pride. Naomi's leadership proved that empowerment and respect could inspire people to reach their potential. Meanwhile, Sandra Hall had elevated her team to new heights at the Bronzeville branch. Under her guidance, the location had become one of the top-performing branches in the chain. Sandra's leadership wasn't barking orders or micromanaging. It was about listening, collaborating, and valuing her team's input. During a break, Elijah sat with Sandra in the dining area. You've built something incredible here, he said. Sandra smiled. Thank you, Mr. Carter. But it's not just me, it's the team. They're the ones making this work. Her humility and dedication reflected the culture Elijah had dreamed of, a workplace where collaboration and mutual respect were the norm. The delivery team also flourished. Drivers like Ahmed Ali had embraced their roles with renewed pride. The once overlooked delivery operations now ran smoothly, with updated vans, fair schedules, and managers who valued their contributions. Ahmed approached Elijah with a wide grin on one visit to the delivery hub. Mr. Carter, I just wanted to say thank you. It feels good to come to work now. People see us, and they respect us. Elijah shook his hand firmly. You've earned that respect, Ahmed. Thank you for believing in this company. The success of the reforms also extended beyond the employees. Customers noticed the change too. Positive reviews flooded in, praising the food and the warm and attentive service. Soulful Bites wasn't just a place to eat anymore. It symbolized community and belonging. One day, Elijah received a letter from a longtime customer. It read, I've always loved Soulful Bites, but lately, it feels different, in the best way. The staff seems happier, the service is friendlier, and the atmosphere is brighter. Thank you for creating a space where people feel welcome. The words struck a chord with Elijah. Soulful Bites had always been about more than just food. It was about connection, humanity, and shared values. Elijah addressed the staff from every location at the company's annual meeting. Standing on the stage, he looked at the sea of faces, familiar and new, united by the journey they had taken together. I want to start by saying thank you, Elijah began, his voice steady but emotional. This company wouldn't be here without every one of you. You've weathered the storm and helped build something better in its place. He paused, letting his words settle. When I started Soulful Bites, I dreamed of creating more than just a restaurant. I wanted to build a community where everyone felt valued and respected, from the dishwasher to the executive chef. Over the past year, we've faced hard truths, made difficult changes, and challenged ourselves to improve. And because of your resilience, your courage, and your dedication, we've succeeded. The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing with pride and solidarity. Elijah mingled with employees as the meeting ended, listening to their stories and sharing joy. Many expressed gratitude for the changes, but Elijah reminded them that the proper credit belonged to them. You're the reason we're here today, he told Naomi during a quiet moment. Your strength, your leadership, drives this company forward. Naomi smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Carter. It means everything to know that we matter. Later that evening, as Elijah walked through the quiet streets of Chicago, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The path had been fraught with challenges, resistance, self-doubt, and the weight of dismantling systemic issues. But the results spoke for themselves. Soulful Bites was no longer just a restaurant chain. It was a testament to the power of resilience, accountability, and the belief that change was possible. Elijah knew the work wasn't over. Maintaining the culture they had built would require vigilance and continued effort. But he felt a profound sense of hope for the first time in years. Looking up at the city's skyline, Elijah allowed himself a small smile. He had fought for his employees, values, and the dream he had carried since his days on the South Side. And now, that dream was alive, not just in the numbers or the accolades, but in the people who made Soulful Bites what it was. It wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was real. And for Elijah Carter, that was more than enough. The story of Elijah Carter and Soulful Bites isn't just a tale of a business overcoming adversity. It's a reminder of the transformative power of accountability, empathy, and persistence. Elijah's journey highlights how even the most successful ventures can lose sight of their core values and how courageous leadership takes them back on course. This story highlights systemic issues that often go unnoticed until someone dares to confront them. Elijah's willingness to step into his employees' shoes, listen, and act decisively demonstrates the profound impact of valuing people over profits. From Naomi's rise as a respected leader to Ahmed's newfound pride in his work, the ripple effects of change are undeniable. The lesson here is clear. Leadership is not about maintaining control, but empowering others. It's about creating spaces where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected, regardless of position. For Soulful Bites, this transformation wasn't just about fixing a workplace. It was about redefining what it meant to be a community. As we reflect on this journey, we're reminded that, while challenging, change is always worth pursuing. Elijah's story teaches us that no matter how entrenched the problem is, progress begins with the courage to take the first step. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? Did it make you think about the power of compassion and leadership? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was terrific, comment with a 2. Do you have a story about overcoming challenges or fostering change in your own life? Share it with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear about it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss another meaningful story. Your thoughts and support inspire us to continue sharing tales that matter. Let us know what you think about this journey in the comments below.